Hey, everybody. Glad you're joining us. Welcome to Harbor Point. However, you might be joining us, however, you might be tuning in. My name is Jeff. I'm one of the pastors here. And I know as you kind of encounter a church scenario, whether it's your first time or maybe you're coming back after a long time, or maybe you're just kind of investigating a whole bunch of stuff about what God is about or what the church is about, let me just try to put you at ease about who we are as a church. We do not have all the answers, and we certainly do not have everything figured out. And as you'll find, as you're maybe hanging out or meeting people, whatever, from our church community, what you'll discover is this is a group of people who are work in progress kind of people. And so we're aiming our lives at Jesus. We believe that's what we were made for. We're operating with the kind of conviction that this is what we were kind of designed to do together. And the best thing we got going in our church isn't what happens on a screen or in any of our programs or all that stuff. It's really what happens with each other. We believe we were made for life together. It's why we say all the time that it's good to be together. So it is good to be together. And we got a lot to cover today. So let's jump right in with it. Let me ask you, what do all of these things have in common? Bacon and eggs for breakfast, engagement rings, diamond engagement rings, more specifically, diamond engagement rings, birthday cakes with, of course, candles on them, and green bean casserole. Every single one of these things is a cultural norm that all of us have come to expect at certain times. I mean, no one tries to propose with something other than a ring, especially a diamond ring. It's sort of like, well, what did we, if you did that, what's the deal? Of course, I actually did that. We didn't have enough money. I proposed with just a regular old gold band. I bought it Mervin's, which became Kohl's. Anyways, that's a whole different story. But most people, the expectation is, hey, when you're proposing, it's a diamond engagement ring. And most people, when you think of breakfast, if I show you bacon and eggs, like that's breakfast. But every single one of these things, which are now cultural norms, were the result of coordinated ad campaigns. Even the phrase, the most important meal of the day is breakfast, that comes from Kellogg's. It was an invented thing. And all of these things are virtually unchallengeable in the way we think about them. That someone, at Campbell's Soup Company was trying to figure out how do we sell more cream of mushroom soup. In the 1950s, they made up the recipe for green bean casserole. It's why everybody has it at Thanksgiving. And people were trying to figure out how do we sell more birthday cakes? We got to put candles on them. Special candles are called birthday candles. All of that stuff, all of it was designed like a coordinated ad campaign that became part of the culture. And it's almost unchallengeable, and it's universally accepted that this is the way things are done. Now, what we find out about with this kind of illustrates is that whatever gets repeated enough will become normal. So if you hear enough that breakfast is the most important meal of the day, or the De Beers Diamond Company says, there's this diamonds are forever, and they invent this idea, and all of a sudden we're buying into it. As soon as they repeat it enough, it will become normal. And whatever is normal, when that gets repeated enough, it will become a norm, and a norm repeated enough will become culture. So, however it is that we kind of get to this place, what gets repeated enough that we begin to embrace enough times becomes part of our culture, and those kinds of things start shaping our expectations, our wants, and our preferences, and it gives us a sense of how people ought to live, about what's reasonable. And we begin, all of us do, unconsciously more often than not, we begin to attach ourselves to that particular way of thinking or being. This is how we sort of start following along as a culture. Now, we're in week 4 of a series called What Practice Makes. And in it, we've been kind of launching the series that, with the premise that everybody has a couple of similar needs. One of them is to be, that we, as we said this throughout the whole series, everybody has a need to be known and acknowledged and seen, warts and all, for whatever they've got going on in their life, that they're seen and acknowledged, that just as they are. And then secondly, that every single one of us has also internally an own need to become something, that we are already becoming something, but also the idea behind it is that some way all of us have a sense of like, is there some other thing we could be becoming that we actually might want to become? And the Bible, as we've been saying throughout this whole series, is just simply saying this idea. Psalm 139, so kind of reiterating this in its own version. For you created, this is a prayer, you created my inmost being, you knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I'm fearfully and I'm wonderfully made, and your works are wonderful, and I know that full well. And then he goes on to say, same writer, a couple verses later, search me, God, and know my heart, and test me and know my anxious thoughts, and see if there's any way in me that's offensive, and then lead me in the everlasting way. Like, I know there's some stuff in me that I can't even see sometimes that ought to be worked on, that there's some kind of part of me becoming that's going to require your guidance or your assistance, because I don't even know sometimes what that looks like. Now, this process of becoming, the becoming process in a lot of sort of Christian circles is just, which is not exclusively a Christian word, but the way a lot of sort of Christian people talk about it, Christian thinkers, is the word formation. This is the process of becoming something. And as we've been talking about it, this whole idea is largely a result of a couple of things. It's this interplay between our habits and our character and our wants or our loves that constantly one influencing the other. And we came across the idea that or came across the research that said about 95% of our lives is pretty much unconscious, where we're doing all of these things, and the interplay between all of these things that you see on the screen, this loves and habits and character and all of that stuff, is almost exclusively not directed effort, just sort of happening behind the scenes and underneath the thing. Which does illustrate another layer of this, which we have to talk about today, which is that there is no not being formed. I mean, there's no place in which there's no place where we're standing still and not doing anything. The question we have to ask, if we're really trying to be kind of insightful about our own lives, is to ask this question. If there is no not being formed, the question we have to ask is, well, then by who or into what? Probably more specifically, by whom, if you're really technical, but by who or into what are we being transformed? Or are we being formed into a particular thing? But none of us gets to stand still. All of us, because 95% of our lives are directed by things that are actually unconscious, all of us have to ask the question, well, what am I being formed into? Now, today I want to propose an idea, and it's going to sound contradictory, and I can already feel some of the resistance to it, and I just want to kind of throw it out there because I think there's some real value in it. In fact, if we take it seriously, I think for a lot of people, this could be a real turning point. So here it is, and I'll walk through it and we'll kind of point it out. Some of you are going to have some resistance to it. That's okay. I get it. Here we go. What if you and I, right now, just us, what if you and I are already living the life we always wanted? Like, what if you and I right now, our life right now, you're like, you don't know my life. But what I'm trying to say is, what if you and I right now are already living the life we always wanted? Now, because I can already think a lot of you are like, you don't know my life, and there's a ton of exceptions, and I get it. There are exceptions. Some of us, there's circumstances we didn't choose. I get that. Things that are happening to us, we never would have wanted or chosen. They've just happened. I get it. But I want to say all of us are responding to the circumstances that we're in, and we're making choices within that, which to say, again, there are exceptions, but to say, at least for a practical matter, what if you and I are already living the life we always wanted? Now, the basis of this is the basis of what is sometimes called, it's an economic theory called the revealed preference theory. And it's really simple. All it says is, look, there's a limited kind of resources budget that you and I have between time and money and attention and energy. There's just a limited amount of stuff that we've got to be able to utilize to make kind of sense of our lives and to make choices. And the way you can determine what it is that you value most is by what we value most gets the most out of that budget. So again, whether it's time, money, attention, energy, etc., we reveal our preference by what we are already choosing. What we value the most gets the most or the highest allocation or the biggest chunk of that budget. Now, what's important to keep this in mind here is that it's different than what we ought to value the most. It's just what we actually value. If you're asking people what they should value, that's a different conversation. But when you ask people how it is that they're investing their time, attention, money, and resources, energy, etc., into a particular thing, that's what's actually revealing what they value the most. So in other words, where we are now is really the cumulative effect of thousands of decisions, small decisions and big decisions or whatever, but now is the cumulative effect of a bunch of deciding, which means you and I might already be living the life we always wanted. The question we have as we think about that, though, is why is it that we valued the things that we valued the most? If we're spending, we're investing the most of our own kind of resources into things that we value most, the question is, why did we value those things, especially the things we wish we didn't value? Like, why did we value those things based on how we actually spent our resources? Why do we value those things even if we didn't really want to value them at all? Sometimes we're told this is what's most important, but more often than not, we just sort of knew what was most important and nobody told us, and there was no kind of drawn out explanation of what that's supposed to be like. We just knew. Now, whether it's bacon and eggs for breakfast, or it's a diamond engagement ring, or a birthday cake, or a casserole, anything reinforced enough will enable us to stop thinking about it, and it will become our default position. And once that happens, those things kind of become, this is the process of what's sometimes called acculturation. What happens, there's sort of unwritten expectations start to form for us, for other people, how we ought to live. And there are implicit and obvious rules There are ways of being that all of us begin to adopt, and they get mutually transmitted, and they get repeated, and they get reinforced, and over again. This is how we sort of begin the way everybody starts to live. Actually, one way to sort of illustrate it is to think about all of the humor or all of the sort of dramatic points in the what is sometimes called the fish out of water movie or the fish out of water story. This is, by the way, give you an example. This is like the country boy, goes to live with his family in the city, and he can't really figure out. He's just so unaware of all of the obvious things everybody in the city knows. And, or maybe like sort of the reverse would be sort of a Hallmark movie, where there's always someone from the city who's going to buy the farm of the people who are making the bake sale to save the town. And then all that stuff. And then they come back to their hometown and they decide to leave the city and all that. That's all that. You get the idea, right? Now, what you find in the third act of all of these movies, if they do it right, is that the person who's the outsider is not the only person who's transformed. Oftentimes, in the best kind of stories, it's that the person who's the outsider, this unaware person, actually sees something that the people who are in this kind of particular situation don't often see, because they're an outsider to the way that the culture is living. Now, in the Bible, the culture is broadly broken up, and it's a little bit more chunky than this. I get this, but in the Bible, culture is broadly broken up into two categories. Okay, the kingdom of the world and the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven, as Matthew will talk about it. These are totally different systems of beliefs and practices and norms, and they are rivals because they have different aims that intend to form people differently. That the long view of how a person lives as a citizen or as a member, as a person who belongs in each of these two kingdoms, will form them into something that's entirely different. So one writer, a guy named Alan Kreider, he says, with regard to this is actually really crucial. He says, look, God used not influential or powerful people, but obscure fishers and hunters to achieve a huge end, speaking of the early church. Churches grew in many places, taking varied forms. They proliferated because the faith that these fishers and hunters embodied was attractive to people who were dissatisfied with their old cultural and religious habits. So in other words, people come to sort of understand the group of people who follow Jesus, and they're like, there's something about the way that these people are living that is contrary to the way that the wider society or the way that the wider culture is living. And that was something that the people seemed to want, because they got tired of the way the world works. Keep on reading. These are people who felt pushed to explore new possibilities and who then encountered Christians who embodied a new manner of life, a new way of being that pulled them toward what Christians called rebirth into a new life. In other words, Jesus' people offered a kind of cultural alternative on the back of the idea that so much of what the wider society offered appeared to be kind of broken. What was understood by these people who were coming to faith was not only that the culture was broken, they began to understand that there was a kind of parting with the loyalty that they had with the current world and its cultural systems. They were going to have to put that secondary to the way of life in the community of people who follow Jesus. They understood that to be the case. Now, maybe, this is why when Jesus calls people to faith, the most common phrase he uses to call people to faith isn't the phrase believe, although it's there. And it's not here's how to be saved. And it's not, maybe as you might have heard of it, it's not here's how to get to heaven when you die. When Jesus is calling people to faith, he says something different when he's calling them to him. Here's what he says. Matthew, I'm going to click through a bunch of these. Matthew 4, 18 and 19. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come and follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. At once they left their nets and followed him. Skipping forward a bit. Going on from there, verse 21, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, and they were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets, and Jesus called them. And immediately they left the boat and their father, and they followed him. Matthew 9, as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me, he told them. Matthew got up and followed him. You get where this is going. Matthew 16, then Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Over and over again, 2 to 1 times to the word believe is the word follow, or some variation of the word follow. 2 to 1. Like there's something, as we talk about what this looks like, that's way different than sort of simply just acknowledging some things. Now, the word disciple, well, let me back up a little bit. Jesus is characterized as a kind of a teacher, a rabbi, right? And his followers, his disciples are called Talmid, or Talmidim is the plural. In the Greek, it looks like this, mathetes. And the word sometimes gets utilized, sort of translated as the idea of student or pupil. And that's true, it's accurate. If you got a teacher, then the people that follow them would be a student. But the description of these particular kinds of people, disciples, they're not characterized just as students. In fact, one of the ways that you could kind of characterize someone who is a student of a rabbi or a disciple of a rabbi is to say that their feet was covered in the dust of the rabbi. Like they followed them so closely that it wasn't just about learning what the teacher knows. That's what a student would do. It's not just knowing what a teacher knows, but really it's about becoming as the teacher is. Thus the expression that your feet might be covered in the dust of the rabbi. It's maybe perhaps a better word might be the word apprentice. And my favorite example of this, I always use this because I'm just stunned how good of an example this is. This from my, that sounds like I think I'm just one. The story got told to me. It's not my story, but my mother-in-law was traveling. So whatever. My mother-in-law was traveling in Italy, and she goes to this place where I guess it's like a school for sculptors, and so sculptors are there and they're working on all this stuff. And she asks the tour guide, she's like, "Oh, is this guy the kind of the main guy? Is he like the teacher here?" And so the tour guide goes over and asks, and the guy is older, and he says, the tour guide comes back and says, no, he just said that he's an apprentice. And she goes, "How long has he been an apprentice?" He said 40 years. 40 years. Which raises the obvious question, how does an apprentice know when they're no longer an apprentice? And the answer is, when the work of the apprentice is indistinguishable from the work of the master. That's how you know when you're done. That's how you know when the sort of apprenticeship is over. And in this case, what you kind of get the picture already, that it's possible to live your whole life as an apprentice. The one definition of this word mathetes, which you saw, I just showed you a second ago, this definition here, there's one more kind of in the sort of long extended book of definitions in the, sort of one of the resources is called the TD&T, the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, says it this way. Mathetes always implies the existence of a personal attachment, notice the language, which shapes the whole life of the one described as mathetes. And which in its particularity leaves no doubt as to who is deploying the formative power. The one who is the disciple, the student, the pupil, that person, is attaching themselves to this teacher to be shaped to become, their whole life to become like that person. And there is no mistaking how the shaping is happening. It's because of that person, that master, the rabbi, the teacher, who is doing the shaping of the student. When their life, or their project for that matter, is indistinguishable from the work of the master. A disciple is a person intending to be formed by attachment. Now, I'll give you one example, kind of a little bit. I don't have time to go through the whole thing, but I'll give you an example that kind of sets the stage for kind of where we are. Luke chapter 18, some of you might know this story. It says this, verse 18, a certain ruler asked him. Sometimes he's called the rich man, sometimes he's called the young man. So in this case, you have this ruler, which just for a second, we'll just talk that a ruler would be someone who has some measure of influence and power, a person who is gaining some kind of level of importance because they're connected properly in the greater cultural world in which they live. Right? Are you with me? So this is a certain ruler asked him, meaning Jesus. A certain ruler asked Jesus, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Now, there's a lot more we could talk about this, but the simplest sort of way is to kind of talk about it, at least in this context. There are more things to talk about when it comes to this. But the simplest way to talk about this is, how do I participate in the life of participation and working with and partnership with God? What does that look like to join in him in that particular life, now and forever? But yes, right now, how is it that I join in that particular kind of life? So, skipping ahead, Jesus says, you know the commandments. You shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not give false testimony, honor your father and mother. Now, by the way, these are all of kind of what we would sort of call the horizontal commandments of the 10 commandments, the big 10 commandments. Some of you know what I'm talking about with the 10 commandments. But these are all the horizontal ones. There aren't any here that say anything about worshiping God, which is an interesting sort of thing to think about for another time. But just notice that. All these I've kept since I was a boy, he said. And then Jesus said, you still lack one thing. Sell everything you have, give to the poor, and you'll have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me. So he says, like, look, there's one more thing. He's like, I've done all the obedience stuff you asked me, but there's one more thing. Jesus says, okay, well, sell everything you've got. Because what the guy is asking is, how is it that I participate in the particular life that you promise, or we get to participate and join in and have some kind of partnership? What's that all about? And he says, oh, you got one thing that you're missing. And that missing thing is that you are somehow being owned by your stuff. So he says, sell it all and give it to the poor. Then you can come and follow me. When he heard this, the man heard this, he became very sad because he was very wealthy. Very sad because he was very wealthy. Now, there's a lot to this, but he got his answer. I mean, he asked Jesus, this isn't working. The system that I'm attached to here seems to be different than the way of life that we would call eternal kind of life. It's broken. Can you help me figure out what's missing? And Jesus gives him an answer, and he doesn't like the answer. He's like, there's something that's lacking, but Jesus gives him an answer, and he doesn't like the answer, and he went away sad. What he's essentially asking, again, there's so many more layers to the story, but he's essentially asking this: how can I have a life-changing encounter with Jesus without having to change my life? How can I have a life-changing encounter with Jesus without changing my life? Yes, Jesus, I want all this stuff. This is so great. I love what you're doing. You know, I'm a big influential person in a particular system, and now I want to figure out how to belong in your particular system, the way the world you're talking about, this kingdom of heaven is. And Jesus mentions it a lot in his own sort of speech and modes of, kind of, I don't know, discipling people or kind of helping them to follow him. He talks about the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of God. And this guy's like, I want that. And Jesus goes, this is what it looks like. And he went away sad. There's this line from, it's a kind of a deep cut, a U2 song, but it actually features Johnny Cash as the lead singer. It's from an album called Pop, which I think was pretty much a commercial, not that much of a success. But here's the line in the song, sung by Johnny Cash. Okay, he says this: I sat outside a church house where the citizens like to sit. And they say they want the kingdom, but they don't want God in it. Like, this is essentially what this person is attempting to do. I want all of the kingdom kind of quote unquote promises, but I don't really want to have to do all the hard stuff. I don't want to change, and maybe I don't even want Jesus to be a part of it. You see, this highlights a kind of thing that 21st century people tend to fall into, myself, everybody included. It's just that there's a tendency we fall into a particular kind of thinking, which is we really, really like the idea of separating, drawing a distinction between faith, believing, and following. Like, those two things are way different things. I believe a thing to be true. I can acknowledge all the true things of a particular statement. I can acknowledge that it's true, but following it is different. And that's not something that the first century church would have done. You and I would do it all the time. It's like, I know that's true, but I'm not sure I'm going to follow it. That's probably a healthy distinction for a lot of times. But when it comes to Jesus and following him, believing and following are overlapping necessarily, which means the first church would have never separated believing and following at all. Those two things, if you had said I was a believer in Jesus, it would have assumed that you would have been a follower of him. Nobody could simply believe in Jesus and not follow. It just would have made no sense. You see, the reason why that's so important is, thinking of the larger context of the whole message, is that what Jesus knows is that following is forming. Following is a kind of forming. Whatever it is that we follow will form us. We become like the things that we follow. Think about it for a second. If you're a social media person, which is most people on the planet, I'm not one of them, but you get the idea that if you ever meet a stranger and someone says, hey, here's this person, I want you to meet this person. It's a big famous person. You haven't heard of them, but they're a big deal. The very next thing you would more than likely do is you would go, what's their name, or what's their Instagram handle, or what's their TikTok handle, whatever else, are they on Snap? And you would find out all of the stuff that their first thing you look at is, what is it that they post? What is it that they're showing off about themselves that they want the world to see? And the next question, which may be more important, is who or what do they follow? Who or what do they follow? Because following is always forming. Following is always forming. Because regardless of whether you believe this or not, whether or not you're sure about Jesus or whatever, there is no not being formed. And every one of us has to ask the question, by the things that we are following, the ideas that we're chasing, whatever that might be, we have to be asking the question, by whom or into what am I being formed? There's no not being formed. There is no somehow avoiding it. There is no standing still. Even standing still is a way of being formed. So A disciple, like we said, is a person who is intentionally trying to be formed by attaching themselves to something. Like, this is who I want to become. This is the kind of person I want to become. I'm trying to become that. You with me? Now, disciples then, who are trying to be formed by attaching themselves to the way of another person, is then also, again, it can be a disciple of anything, but they are trying to do so by taking on particular practices that get repeated, because we know when you repeat things, they become sort of norms, right? With me? The sort of disciples then, the norms that are the practices that go with disciples, then you would just call disciplines, right? Now, we tend to think of disciplines as like, you got in trouble, that's a discipline, you're being disciplined. But really, just thinking about it as this is the ways or the practices of those people who are disciples. You see the same word almost right there. So let me give you a couple things to kind of consider as you look at this, as we kind of talk a little bit deeper about this idea of disciplines. First of all, you and I have to come into at least some sort of, we have to come into some sort of understanding about what it is that we're immersed in. The first sort of thing to sort of transforming ourselves to become, if we want to become more and more, and again, you could apply this to anything, but let's just say for those people who are interested in following Jesus, this is what it looks like. First is a kind of immersion. In other words, what is it that I'm following? If following is forming, to use our analogy or to use our language, what is it or who is it that I'm following? Is it an idea? Is it a person? Whatever it is, I'm immersing myself in the following of that person. For people who are disciples of Jesus, they're obviously kind of aiming their lives, as we say, what it means to be shaped by the person of Jesus. Secondly, is the sort of relational connection or social connection that goes along with that, which is who I'm with. I'm going to be shaped not just simply by my own focused attention, energy, and effort upon a particular person or a thing, but also the people that I'm doing this with. It's crucially important. I mean, people in everything from, AA to Weight Watchers to every other kind of recovery program, everybody will tell you that to have a lasting impact, to have a lasting effect for transformation in your life, you cannot do it alone. In fact, the impact is almost 2-to-1 better in terms of all these other sort of measurable things, i.e. like Weight Watchers or, Alcoholics Anonymous or et cetera. All of those people have a much greater success when they attend meetings, when they go and they do it with someone else, which is why we put such an emphasis on life groups. We'll get to that in a moment. Now, lastly then, is things that we do by repetition. So immersion, connection, repetition. These are the things that are shaping us to be the kind of people. I mean, this is how, whatever it is that we're doing in this particular way is shaping us to become that particular kind of person. Now, repetition then is just simply what I do on the regular. What kinds of things am I doing all the time that's intentional or not? But what am I doing the most is shaping me into to becoming a particular kind of person. So what I follow, who I'm with, and what I do. These are the most critical kinds of things to think about. Now, when it comes to us, so right now, again, I'm just giving you a broad overview of some kind of things here, but when it comes to us, what I want you to think about is, my buddy, I'll point this out, but so this is the number of minutes in a particular week. 10,080 is the number of minutes in a week. Let's suppose that 80 minutes of those, if you're, part of our church community, 80 minutes of those is lived at church. So, 65-minute service, plus, you got a donut and a cup of coffee, and you got to run your kids around a little bit if you got kids, or maybe you want to run around and jump on the slide or whatever. I don't know, whatever it is. But there's some part of us let's call that 80 minutes of the week. That means there's that 80 minutes of being at church or being immersed in this particular kind of thing is less than 1% of your total week. Right? So just think about it in those terms. My buddy, Tim Timmons, by the way, who he has a podcast called 10,000 Minutes. And it is literally it's a podcast dedicated to the idea of just helping people figure out how to live the rest of their life outside of those 80 minutes. By the way, there's a movie coming out about him. He's one of my best friends. We were buddies in junior high, went to summer camp together, all that kind of stuff. Movie coming out on February 20th, I think. There's a little free plug. Anyway, but he says, look, how do we get people engaged in the other 10,000 minutes? Because if all that we're doing is relying on 80 minutes of all of those things, immersion and social connection and repetition of practice to be those 80 minutes once a week to do it, then what we're essentially we might be saying is that we're looking for a life-changing encounter with Jesus without having to change our life. I'm waiting for a great moment where the songs kind of swell and I feel connected to it, or a great insightful thing from whoever's teaching, or some moment where I run into someone, but then the rest of my life is kind of on my own. We're actually unconsciously, we're trying to sort of live a life where we have a life-changing encounter with Jesus, but that we don't really want anything else to change in our lives. Now, back to life groups once again. life groups start, all of our life group experience, the connected life together that we have as a church community starts with what we call Rooted. Right now, Rooted it's in I think it's the fourth or fifth week of its sort of, this particular session. And in it, what you get is not the one-off experience of each week. There's 10 weeks in Rooted. There's not the one-off experience that this is like, wasn't that neat? The idea is to give us a sort of blueprint for the rhythms, what we call the rhythms of Rooted or the rhythms of life group. This is how this is supposed to work, that there are regular intentional patterns that are designed to help us to become the kind of people who are attached more and more to Jesus. Now, so let me give you these are regular intentional patterns. I'm just going to give you one of my regular patterns. Some of you heard me talk about this before, but my practice, sort of my regular rhythm of stuff, 6 days a week, roughly, sometimes it's 5, is like, I get up in the morning and a cup of coffee, bowl of oatmeal, and then I listen to a passage from the audio Bible. It's actually it's an older practice called the Lectio Divina, but anyway, it's like, you can look it up on, Spotify or whatever, you can find this, but I listen to the audio Bible, and then I just have a little notebook, like a journal, and I'm writing some stuff down. It takes probably 15 minutes or so. Sometimes I'll take longer if I have the time, but I'm out in my patio, and I got the first one up. I can hear the neighborhood dogs waking up, and I can hear people kind of shuffling around in the morning, and I just put a heater on, and I just sit there, and this is my time in the morning. And what I realize is, for the longest time in my life, I realized, how am I going to have time I don't have time to do this. I have so many things I got to get going on through my life. And over time, as I began to kind of take on this practice, over time, what I began to realize is, when I would miss it, is, first of all, when I'd miss it, here's what I would go when I'd miss it. And I'm not trying to make it like, we'll talk about this probably next week, but this isn't like, this is the most important thing in my life is the practice. The most important thing is the connection. So when I miss it, I try not to live in kind of the shame of, I missed this particular moment. That's not really the goal here. But I just sort of think about it this way. Where do I go when I skip it? So here's what I'll do. I'll just kind of watch the news. I'll read the news. And if I don't do that, what I'll just start looking for is, what stuff do I want to buy online? I mean, on my phone, just start looking for stuff I want. This is what I do. I'm not proud of it. It's just part of what I do. So here's what I'm doing. I either hear about how the world is unsolvable and the crisis in my own neighborhood and all that kind of stuff. I'm latching onto the hysteria of unsolvable problems, that apparently unsolvable problems that I don't know how to help. And then I'm also sort of identifying with all the things I don't have that would make my life better if I have them. That's how I would start my day if I didn't start it the other way. And there's no mistaking that kind of way of living is actually forming me. It shapes me. Because this is the way that's the most available to me. No one had to tell me this. I just started this is just how I start thinking. So I have to intentionally think about, push into, interrupt that process every morning for a little time of reflection on God's word and a little time of prayer to begin. And maybe there is more that I ought to be doing throughout the rest of my day. And some of you are like, you do that better than anybody. But for me at this point, if I miss those minutes in the morning, my life and my aim starts to get a little bit off, and I start to become more of like kind of trapped in the old way of living that I don't want to live in anymore, or at least in the way of thinking. So you get how that works. Now, you have 10,000 minutes. I get that there's minutes where, some of you are like, but I sleep for 8 hours. I get it. You're really smart. Way to go. You need your sleep. I'm not saying literally the unconscious eyes closed moments in your life, but of the 10,000 minutes that you're maybe not contemplating actively about who Jesus is, in a worship service, what do those minutes look like? And you might not be ready to kind of go, I'm ready to aim my life at Jesus. I'm not sure I'm there yet. But at least have the idea of what is directing your attention, energy, effort, focus. What is it that you value most? What's getting the most of all the resources that are given to you? Because whatever that is shaping you to become something. So, you got 10,000 minutes. To what do you want to attach? Because it will shape you. Let's pray together. Jesus, we're grateful that you are shaping us, and that you have already come and rescued us. For those of us who have chosen to walk with you in faith, for those of us who haven't yet, Jesus, would you begin to reveal yourself a little bit more to us? But you've already done this great work, and yet you're still patient with us as we're a work in progress, becoming who you've intended us to become. And so, Jesus, as we take next steps, even to call into question sort of our own thinking or our thoughts about how we might live or understand what it is to walk with you and to be shaped and to be formed. Thank you that you're gentle with us. Thank you that you're present with us. Thank you that you're constantly calling us. And so might we become the people that you've intended us to become. In your name, Jesus, we pray. Amen.